You're in the shower, your hand stops, you feel something that shouldn't be there, a small lump. And in that exact moment, your life splits into before and after, because what you just found may look tiny, but it is already massive. Here's the reality no one tells you. The smallest lump you can feel, about 1 centimeter, can already contain over 1 billion cancer cells. 1 billion. That means it didn't just show up. It didn't start yesterday. It has been growing inside your body, silently, undetected, for a long time. And while you were going about your life, something else was happening beneath the surface. Your body saw it long before you did, and it was already trying to stop it. So, if that's true, then everything you've been told about early detection starts to feel different. Because by the time you find it, the real story is already well underway. And that leads to a far more important question, one that most people never think to ask. If this didn't start today, then when did it actually begin? Hello, I'm Dr. Nathaniel Li. I'm an emergency medicine physician and a medical researcher. After more than 30 years of studying how the body protects and heals itself and witnessing patients struggle with chronic diseases that I now believe, in many cases, could be treated far more easily than we've been taught, I began to question whether we've been missing something fundamental about the body's natural ability to heal. And what I discovered completely changed the way I think about disease. When a patient looks at me and asks, "Why me?" I don't ignore the question. I understand the fear behind it. I've heard it in emergency rooms, in quiet exam rooms, in moments when everything feels uncertain. But over the years, I realized something uncomfortable. That question, as natural as it sounds, may be the wrong place to start. Because if you truly understand how the human body works, a different question begins to emerge, one that is far more unsettling and far more important. Why don't we get cancer more often? Every single day, inside your body, cells are dividing, replicating, and repairing. And with every division, there is a chance, small but real, that something goes wrong. DNA can mutate. Instructions can become corrupted. A perfectly normal cell can begin to behave unpredictably. In other words, your body is constantly producing cells that have the potential to become dangerous. And yet, most of the time, nothing happens. You don't feel it. You don't see it. Your life goes on as if everything is perfectly fine. That's because your body isn't passive. It is actively scanning, detecting, and correcting these errors long before they ever become visible. Systems are working in the background quietly, efficiently removing threats you never even knew existed. And this is where everything begins to shift. Because instead of asking why something appeared, we have to ask what allowed it to survive. And it is precisely in that gap between those two questions where the entire story begins to change. Contrary to what most people imagine, cancer does not begin as a powerful invader. It doesn't arrive suddenly, fully formed, ready to take over. It starts quietly with a single cell, one cell whose DNA has been altered, damaged, or miscopied. At first, nothing dramatic happens. That cell divides, then divides again. A tiny cluster begins to form, almost invisible, almost irrelevant. No pain, no signal, no alarm. But here's the critical detail most people never hear. In its earliest stage, that cluster of abnormal cells is essentially trapped. It exists in isolation, without access to the resources it needs to grow. No dedicated blood supply, no steady oxygen, no consistent nutrients. It is in many ways cut off from the system that would allow it to expand. And because of that limitation, its growth is not unlimited. It reaches a natural boundary, typically around 2 to 3 millimeters in size, about the tip of a pencil. And then it stops. At this stage, your body still has the upper hand. Your immune system can recognize something is off. Repair mechanisms can attempt to correct the damage. In many cases, these early abnormal cells are identified and removed long before they ever become a problem. Which means what we often think of as the beginning of cancer is actually something your body has already dealt with countless times before. But not always, because sometimes that tiny cluster doesn't disappear. It doesn't grow either. It simply remains, silent, contained, waiting. It doesn't die. It just sits there waiting for one critical thing to happen. What that tiny cluster is waiting for is not time. It is a lifeline. The moment it manages to connect to your body's circulation, everything changes. This process is called angiogenesis, the growth of new blood vessels, and it is the single most decisive turning point in the life of a tumor. Because once a blood vessel reaches that isolated cluster, It is no longer cut off. It now has access to oxygen, to glucose, to everything it needs to survive and expand. It is no longer contained, it is being fed. Think about what that really means. A tumor that was once stuck at just a few millimeters suddenly gains the ability to grow without restriction. It's like handing a starving system a constant supply line. Oxygen fuels its metabolism. Nutrients accelerate its division. Signals from the bloodstream even help it adapt and protect itself. And the change is not gradual, it's explosive. Under the right conditions, that tumor can increase in size up to 16,000 times in a matter of weeks. What was once invisible becomes detectable. What was once controlled becomes unpredictable. And here's the part most people never consider. This isn't something the tumor creates out of nothing. It uses your body's own mechanisms. It sends signals that effectively persuade nearby blood vessels to grow toward it. It hijacks a system that was designed to heal and turns it into a system that helps it grow. So the question is no longer just how cancer forms, but when it crosses this threshold. Because if everything changes the moment blood supply is established, then everything also depends on that exact moment. And if that's true, then a new question emerges: what would happen if you could stop that connection from ever being made? According to Dr. Nathaniel Li, the human body is not passive in the face of cancer, it is designed to resist it. And once you understand this, the entire conversation changes. Because what you're dealing with is not a single defense, but a coordinated system working across multiple levels. Every second of your life, whether you notice it or not, you are not defenseless, you are already equipped. The first layer is your immune system. You can think of it as a constant surveillance network, scanning tissues, identifying abnormalities, and removing cells that don't belong. Every day, immune cells encounter and eliminate potentially dangerous cells before they ever become a problem. Most threats never make it past this stage. The second layer is DNA repair. Your cells are constantly exposed to damage from metabolism, from environmental stress, from simple biological wear and tear, but your body has built-in mechanisms to detect these errors and fix them in real time. Enzymes locate damaged segments of DNA, correct mutations, and restore normal function. It's like having an internal repair team working around the clock to maintain stability. Then there is anti-angiogenesis, the very process we just discussed, but working in your favor. Your body naturally produces factors that prevent unnecessary blood vessel growth. It actively limits the ability of abnormal cells to recruit a blood supply. In other words, it can keep a tumor trapped, starving it before it ever has the chance to expand. And finally, there is the microbiome, trillions of bacteria living primarily in your gut, influencing inflammation, immunity, and metabolic balance. When this system is healthy, it helps regulate inflammatory signals and supports immune function. But when it becomes imbalanced, inflammation rises, and that environment can begin to favor disease. Cancer doesn't just depend on cells, it depends on the environment those cells exist in. When you step back and look at all of this together, one thing becomes clear. Your body is not waiting to be rescued. It is already engaged in a continuous effort to detect, repair, contain, and eliminate potential threat. And most of the time, it succeeds without you ever knowing it happened. And through all of it, whether you realize it or not, that system has been working quietly on your behalf. But that system doesn't always function perfectly. There are moments, gradual, often unnoticed, when the balance begins to shift. The immune system that once identified and removed abnormal cells becomes less efficient. Signals get weaker. Responses slow down. Cells that should have been cleared are now allowed to persist. And at the same time, something else begins to rise: inflammation. Inflammation, in short bursts, is protective. It helps your body respond to injury and infection. But when it becomes chronic, low-grade, persistent, always present, it starts to change the environment inside your body. It creates conditions that abnormal cells can actually benefit from. Instead of being eliminated, they are now surrounded by signals that promote survival and growth. It's like a fire that was meant to protect, but never turns off. As this happens, control begins to weaken across multiple systems. DNA repair becomes less precise. Immune surveillance becomes less aggressive. Anti-angiogenic signals lose their strength. And the tumor, the same one that was once contained, finds opportunities to adapt, to survive, to wait for the moment when it can connect to a blood supply and begin expanding. What was once under control is no longer being tightly regulated. And here's what makes this especially important. This breakdown doesn't happen overnight. It builds slowly, influenced by everyday factors, things that don't feel dramatic, don't feel urgent, and often don't feel connected at all. But they are, because there is one factor, incredibly common, deeply familiar, that is quietly weakening all of these defenses day after day. What's surprising is that the factor influencing all of this doesn't come from a hospital or prescription. It comes from something you interact with every single day. Your food, not in a vague, eat healthy kind of way, but in a very specific biological sense. Certain foods contain natural compounds that can directly affect processes like inflammation, immune activity, and even the growth of blood vessels. In other words, they can influence the exact systems that determine whether a tumor stays contained or begins to grow. This is where the concept of anti-angiogenesis becomes incredibly important. Remember, a tumor cannot expand without a blood supply. And what research has shown is that some foods contain bioactive molecules capable of interfering with that process. They don't attack the tumor directly, they limit its ability to feed itself. That distinction matters, because instead of trying to destroy something after it has grown, you're changing the conditions that allow it to grow in the first place. Take berries, for example, blueberries, strawberries, raspberries. They are rich in compounds like ellagic acid and anthocyanins, which have been shown to help regulate abnormal blood vessel formation and reduce inflammation. Cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, kale, and Brussels sprouts contain sulforaphane, a molecule that supports detoxification pathways and helps modulate cellular signaling linked to tumor growth. Green tea, especially in its more concentrated forms, delivers catechins, powerful polyphenols that can influence both angiogenesis and oxidative stress. And nuts, including walnuts and almonds, provide healthy fats and micronutrients that support metabolic stability and immune balance. When you look at these foods together, a pattern begins to emerge. They are not random. They are not interchangeable. They are part of a system one that aligns with the body's own defense strategies. And that's what makes this so different from the way most people think about nutrition. You're not just fueling your body, you're actively shaping the environment inside it. But among all of these options, all of these compounds, all of these strategies, there is one that has been misunderstood for years, avoided by many, even feared by some. And that's where the story takes an unexpected turn. For years, one of the most common pieces of advice given to women has been to avoid soy. The reasoning sounds logical on the surface. Some breast cancers are sensitive to estrogen, and soy contains compounds often described as plant estrogens. So the assumption became simple: if estrogen can promote certain cancers, then anything that looks like estrogen must be dangerous. But that assumption is incomplete and in many cases incorrect. What soy actually contains are phytoestrogens, specifically compounds like genistein. And while the name suggests similarity, these molecules do not behave the same way as human estrogen in the body. In fact, their structure is different, and more importantly, their function is different. Instead of activating estrogen receptors in a way that promotes growth, phytoestrogens can block those receptors, preventing stronger natural estrogens from binding. In that sense, they can act more like a protective buffer than a trigger. When researchers moved beyond theory and looked at real-world data, the results were consistent. Large-scale studies following women with breast cancer showed that those who consumed higher amounts of soy had lower mortality rates and reduced risk of recurrence. Not slightly lower measurably, significantly lower. And this pattern wasn't isolated. It appeared across multiple populations, multiple studies, and multiple years of observation. The outcome was remarkably consistent. Soy was not increasing risk. It was associated with better outcome. And this is where things become important on a practical level, because sometimes the things we avoid the most are not the ones causing harm. Sometimes they are simply misunderstood. And in cases like this, that misunderstanding can quietly remove something beneficial from your daily life. And sometimes that fear can keep you away from something that might actually help protect you. But even when everything seems to be over, the story doesn't always end there. You go through treatment, the tumor is removed, scans come back clear, you hear the word remission, and for a moment it feels like you've crossed the finish line. But in some cases, months or even years later, something returns. And when it does, it raises a difficult question: where did it come from? What researchers have discovered is that not all cancer cells are the same. Within a tumor, there exists a small, highly resilient population known as cancer stem cells. These cells behave differently. They can survive treatments that eliminate the majority of the tumor. They can remain dormant, hidden, inactive, but not gone. And over time, under the right conditions, they can begin to divide again, effectively rebuilding the tumor from the ground up. They are not just part of the cancer. They are the source that allows it to come back. This is what makes them so significant and so challenging. Because while many therapies are effective at shrinking tumors, targeting these specific cells has proven far more difficult. They are adaptable, resistant, persistent, and in many cases, they remain beyond the reach of conventional treatment, which means that even when everything appears resolved, there may still be something left behind, because there is a type of cell that almost no existing treatment can fully eliminate. And this is where Dr. Nathaniel Li introduces something few people expect. Matcha, a finely ground green tea, delivers an unusually high concentration of polyphenols, especially catechin. Unlike standard brews, you consume the whole leaf, capturing the full spectrum of these compounds. Emerging research suggests these polyphenols can influence pathways tied to cancer stem cell survival, potentially disrupting the very cells most resistant to treatment. It doesn't replace therapy, but it changes the terrain those cells depend on. And that shift matters. Because not every effective solution is engineered in a lab, some have been within reach all along. The human body does not operate in isolated parts. Your gut microbiome, trillions of bacteria, constantly communicates with your immune system and even your brain. Certain strains can signal pathways that influence inflammation, immune surveillance, and the release of hormones like oxytocin, shaping stress responses and recovery. This isn't abstract. It's a network that helps determine how your body responds to threats, including tumor growth. When the microbiome is balanced, it supports resilience. When it's disrupted, that balance shifts. And once you understand that connection, the way you see health begins to change. We often think health begins in a hospital. You get diagnosed, you get treated, and only then does the process begin. But in reality, what we call sick care starts when something has already gone wrong. Healthcare, the kind that actually shapes outcomes, happens long before that moment. It's in the decisions you make every day. What you eat, how you manage stress, how you support your immune system. These aren't small choices, they're signals that influence your body's internal environment. And over time, those signals add up. Because the truth is, it doesn't begin in a clinic. It begins with what you do every single day. If you go back to that very first moment when your hand paused in the shower and you felt something unfamiliar beneath your skin, everything now looks different. At that time, it felt like the beginning of fear, but after understanding what's happening inside the body, you realize something far more profound. That moment was not the start of the disease. It was the moment you became aware of a process that may have been unfolding for years. Inside your body, there has never been silence. Every second, cells are dividing, repairing, mutating, correcting. Immune cells are moving through tissues like patrol units. DNA is being repaired. Errors are being fixed. Threats are being removed before they ever reach your awareness. And most of the time, this system works so efficiently that you never feel it at all. You don't notice health when it is functioning, you only notice when something disrupts it. But what Dr. Nathaniel Li emphasizes is not fear, it is awareness. Because the body is not a passive structure waiting for collapse. It is an active system, constantly responding, adapting, and defending. Even in moments of imbalance, it is still trying to restore order. And that means every signal it sends is not random, it is meaningful. So when you return to that moment again, the question is no longer about what you found, it becomes about what that moment represents. A signal, a warning, a conversation your body has been trying to have with you long before you ever noticed it.